All right, so yeah, that ticking, that fire alarm is really annoying. Let's see if we can survive. All right, so now we're starting the kind of last part of the course where it's mostly just Europe after Rome. And this is where the final exam is going to start. So for the final in a couple of weeks, you're only going to be tested on stuff from this lecture forward. All right, the big thing with the fall of the Roman Empire is it creates chaos. The Roman Empire had ruled most of Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years, and when it suddenly just kind of eviscerated it, like self-destructs, you have all kinds of groups wandering all over the place attacking each other. So we'll try to go through, just real quickly, describe the chaos and how many different groups are moving around, destroying each other and fighting over land. And then we'll focus on one group in particular that are the Franks, that will rebuild kind of a unified empire over the next few hundred years. And then they'll go into a collapse in the 800s. All right, so here's a map of the late Roman Empire, cut in half, the western half and the eastern half. And again, the eastern half survived for a while after the whole system went into collapse, and that was the Byzantine Empire that we've talked about before. Today we're going to talk mostly about what happened to the western half, which is basically chaos. When the Goths invade, it's not just one German group, it's many different groups of German-speaking types of people. And they don't just go down toward Constantinople like we talked about before with the Byzantines. They basically invade the whole western half of the empire and they take over. They do not do this in a unified way. There's perhaps hundreds of different German groups, and they start fighting each other over the most valuable land. So Italy is a big source of conflict. The Ostrogoths move in first. The Visigoths then attack them, and then the Visigoths move on, and the Vandals move in, and it's just one group after another trying to take over Italy. And that will basically repeat in what is today France, what the Romans called Gaul, and even down into what is today Portugal and Spain, which in the ancient world they called Iberia. So this is a process of just chaos. No one's in charge. There's no international law. There's no countries that are formed. It's just like these groups of people that are looking to improve their own position or survive. Does it make sense? So they're moving all over the place, and it's chaos. Eventually, the Vandals move down through today's Spain, Iberia, and then they get kicked out of there by the Visigoths, so the Vandals actually go into North Africa to settle for the long term. Another part of this is... nice. It's over. You have officially survived. Another big part of this is called Britain, which the Romans had conquered and made part of the Roman Empire. Go back to the other map. Yeah. So the Romans had actually conquered the southern part of the British Islands and made it part of the Roman Empire. And when the Roman Empire goes into its collapse phase, basically the Roman government realizes they have a gigantic catastrophe on their hands. So they call their soldiers back home from all over the empire to try to protect themselves, protect their kind of homeland, basically. So when they call the Roman soldiers out of Britain and bring them back to the continent and try to get them back to a place that'd be more valuable, at least to themselves, that really puts the British islands and the people living there, called the Britons, in a kind of difficult position. Their protectors, their security force, is no longer around, which leaves them open to attack from all sides. So the Britons, in their desperation, look to hire an outside army to be their new protectors. And they make a deal with these kind of northern German groups called the Angles and the Saxons and eventually even the Jews, to come into Britain and be their army, basically. So it's a paid army. They're like mercenaries. This ends up being a mistake because these German type of mercenaries move into Britain And they basically say, you have a really nice place here, we'll take it. Because there's no one to stop them. So the Angles and the Saxons particularly, when they get to Britain, they don't just cooperate with the Briton people. They overthrow them and basically colonize Britain. And to the point that they even renamed it, the Angles themselves renamed their holdings Angle Land, which eventually kind of transforms into the word England over many, many years. And their kind of conquest and occupation of what becomes England is basically, for the most part, the southern half of this giant island, is extremely violent. Any Britons, native Britons or Celts or anyone who wants to resist, they're basically annihilated. They're all massacred. So it's either you agree to live under this Angle or Saxon ruled government, or else they'll kill you. So a lot of the Britons are wiped out over decades in this conquest, to the point where the Angles and the Saxons go and they remake the whole culture. So English culture today often identifies as Anglo-Saxon culture. That's where the words come from, because their native Briton culture was kind of wiped out. It was very much wiped out. Does that make sense? And that's just one example of the amount of brutality that's going on all over Western Europe at this time. This is the level of desperation that a lot of groups feel to just try to survive the fall of the Roman Empire, the removal of stability. Does that make sense? Okay. Moving on, there's an island just to the west of Britain, way up here in the kind of top left corner of this map, that is called Ireland, and this totally different culture, speak different language. They were never part of the Roman Empire. The Romans never conquered that island. So that island kind of serves as a home for especially pirates that attacked Roman holdings while the Roman Empire still existed. And this is going on for hundreds of years. So Ireland is a kind of pirate haven they'll live on Ireland, they'll launch raids against Roman cities all along the coastlines. And they'll attack the city, and if they can conquer the city, they'll steal everything of value, and then they'll run back to Ireland so they can't be counterattacked. They can't be caught. So Ireland is seen as a kind of backward, violent place where a lot of people who are outlaws in the Roman Empire go into hiding. That starts to change in the 400s when one pirate raiding group seems to have kidnapped a child of one of the Roman governors of whatever area they're attacking. And they kidnap the kid and bring him back to Ireland as a captive, and they try to ransom him back to this wealthy Roman family. It doesn't work out, so the kid ends up growing up in Ireland as a captive. Eventually spending about 20 years in Ireland, so he's pretty young when he's kidnapped. So he eventually, when he grows up and he's an adult, he chooses to leave Ireland and go back to what we call the continent, the general European continent, and he joins the Christian church and gets educated, and in a pretty remarkable decision decides to go back to Ireland because he remembers it as a kind of uneducated, pretty brutal type of place, and he wants to bring Christianity there to build up brotherhood and equality, and people treating each other better. And he goes back and basically spends the rest of his career in Ireland building up their education system, bringing books in. Patrick eventually goes back and he builds up the Irish education system and the Christian church. So he is often identified as kind of one of the founders of the Irish nation. And he's eventually made into a saint within the church. So he becomes known as St. Patrick over time. And kind of worshipped figure within Irish history, but he was a real living person who took pretty clear actions. Does that make sense? So it's one of the biggest holidays in Ireland is to celebrate St. Patrick's birthday.
Just to celebrate beer.
Yep. I always find interesting that they celebrate it by getting extremely drunk and violent, but all the things that he seemed to have wanted to Ireland to not be. But after he's gone, after he gets old and dies, Ireland really becomes one of the centers of learning and education and scholarship in Western Europe. So he has a profound impact, not just on the society, but the scholarship, the writings that will be done in all of Western Europe. But Ireland is one of the great centers of that. So he has a dramatic impact throughout the whole region, well beyond his own lifetime. So you'll see him in textbooks. But that's just another example of what's happening now that the Roman Empire is gone. It's chaotic. Another group to highlight are called the Franks. They are one kind of Germanish type of group. And when the Roman Empire goes into collapse, the western half is basically a free-for-all. It's like the Wild Wild West. The Frankish group, they are basically a group of a whole bunch of people. They're led by certain wealthy military-type families, so they have their own like private army. They move into northern Gaul at a point when the Roman Empire, the Roman government still exists in Constantinople, and they're trying to figure out how they can hold on to as much land as possible. So the Franks, through messengers, they make a deal with the Roman government that the Franks will occupy this kind of very northern, northeastern area of Gaul. And the Romans permit that because the Romans say, we'll let you live there and you can control the place as long as you run it according to Roman law and you give your kind of allegiance to the Roman Empire. And the Franks think this is a great deal because they're basically going to get free land with official permission. And this place comes to be known as the Netherlands because it's one of the worst areas to occupy. This is like the nether region of Europe. Does that make sense? And has anyone ever been to the Netherlands? You've seen the geography of the Netherlands? Even on a map? It's mostly a bunch of swamps. It's a really kind of horrible, bad place to live. They're so close to sea level that if the tide rises too high, it'll flood the whole place. So today they have these giant, they call them sea walls, to keep the ocean out of their cities. So it's a really kind of a swampy, boggish type of area. And back then it was known as the Netherlands because it was like a horrible place to be. So the Franks start off very small, and they probably choose to occupy that land because they're not powerful enough to conquer anywhere else and kick the Ostrogoths or the Visigoths or whoever else out of that territory. So they start off in the Netherlands. Does that make sense? All right. They start off small, but they'll start building. The most important, the most powerful family of the Franks is called the Merovingian family. So that's their last name. And the Merovingians are basically a family of military leaders, generals, and they have battlefield experience. And so they kind of take up leadership of this Frank group. Not always by choice of the other Franks. Sometimes they have to attack other Franks and kill off other Frankish leaders to get agreement that the Merovingians will be the leader. So that's who the Merovingians are real quick. And the most important Merovingian king is named Clovis. We think he's born in the early 460s. And by the 480s, he's already one of the major Merovingian leaders. So he rises to prominence within his own family, basically as a teenager. And he's extremely aggressive. And he helps lead military attacks to move out of not just this kind of northeastern part on this map, just up in the Netherlands, but will also lead attacks kind of going further south and west, conquering one place after another, and distributing their conquered lands to the Merovingian family members. So he becomes one of the most famous leaders, and also by the 490s, he'll start attacking his own family to bring this whole purple blob of Western Europe under his own personal control. So he'll attack his own brothers, his own nephews and cousins, and anyone who doesn't kind of acquiesce to his leadership, he'll have them killed. So this is the beginnings of the much larger Frankish kingdom, and in his lifetime it's led by him through extremely cutthroat tactics. And there's stories about how he sits down to dinner some nights and he's eating alone because none of his family wants to get close to him because he's a pretty brutal dictator. And he makes jokes at his own dining table. How come none of my family want to come eat with me? It'd be so nice to have some family members around. And reportedly he laughs at his own jokes. So he's making fun of the idea that he's wiped out most of his family, and seems to be one of those power-obsessed kinds of people. And in the early 500s, he converts to Christianity. Most historians analyze this as his attempt to push Christianity on all the people in his kingdom for a kind of unity thing. If you get everyone following the same religion, over generations, people get so used to it as a kind of unified population that they'll be less likely to try to overthrow the leadership, which is him. And while he's doing this, he fills out applications and sends letters to Constantinople trying to get them to officially recognize him as basically Emperor of the West. He justifies all his brutal actions by saying that he's trying to rebuild the Western Roman Empire and form an alliance with the government of Constantinople to, rebuild Rome. Does that make sense? So he's extremely ambitious. Constantinople officially recognizes him as the leader of this kingdom, but they don't want to describe him as a Western emperor because that would elevate him to being as important as the Eastern Empire, the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. Does that make sense? So he wants to be equal with them, but they don't want to be equal with him. They want to look at him as like an underling, a lieutenant who follows their orders.
Or like a smaller king?
Yeah.
Just not on their level.
Yeah. More like a local governor.
Yeah.
So his great ambition is to get to that level, but then he dies a few years later. But as Clovis is doing all this stuff, he's bringing together a lot of different kind of aspects of an emerging kind of Frankish culture, which is kind of it's a combination of different cultures of German backgrounds and Gaul backgrounds and also some Celtic backgrounds. So it's all getting mixed together in this Frankish kingdom. And one example of that historians often point to is called the Wehrgild, which is obviously a German word. But it's a legal code of fines, basically. Frankish government fines. If you commit this crime, then you're going to have to pay this much money. So they're trying to institutionalize this throughout their kingdom to make the law normal, and also to end these feuds that families get into and they attack each other and kill each other in the streets or in the roads. Does that make sense? So that's just one example of the merging of these cultures. Okay, so Clovis dies in 511. And Clovis does something that's pretty normal for people of German background by this point. When he dies, he splits up all of his territory amongst his surviving heirs, his sons. So this map shows you that, several sons. He breaks up the Frankish kingdom into all these different holdings and appoints one son to inherit certain amounts of land. And when those sons grow up, and they have their own children, and then they die, each of these individual plots will be split up into even smaller pieces. And that creates a giant difficulty. You have all these landowners out there that don't trust each other, even though they're members of the same family. They're all, cousins and nephews and whatnot, and they go after each other. Because they're afraid if the person who owns the land next to you as your neighbor, if they get really rich and more powerful, they might build up a big army and attack you someday. So the best line for self-defense is to get more land under your control so you can get more money just to defend yourself. So they all get really paranoid about each other, and they start fighting each other. So within a couple generations after Clovis is gone, the Frankish kingdom that he wanted to unify so much breaks down into a certain level of political chaos. Does that make sense? And even if there's one theoretical leader of all Merovingians on a throne of the whole thing, the individuals don't trust that person very much. They're worried about their own survival. And this continues even into the 600s. So it's getting split up more and more and more. If each generation, if I inherit an amount of land like the size of Fontana, and I have 5 kids, and in my will I break up Fontana into 5 territories for each of my kids. What happens when they grow up and they each have 5 kids? You see how it's getting fragmented down into smaller and smaller amounts? So this becomes so chaotic by, especially getting to the 600s, that this royal family is at each other's throat. So one politician kind of, through some backroom deals, gets this title called the Mayor of the House, which is the official Merovingian king, chief of staff. Runs the king's household. And over time, this Mayor of the House, especially a couple of important guys, throughout their lifetime, they build up the power of that position, where any advice they offer to the Merovingian king is basically going to be approved. So it's this Mayor of the House that's really going to start running the place. Does it make sense? But this Mayor of the House is not a blood relative of the Merovingians, from a different family. So it's another sort of kind of instability. But over time, as the Mayor of the House kind of, through the decades, centralizes power, becomes actually a source of more stability, and tries to stop all the infighting within the royal family. And the most important early mayor of the house is named Pepin. And Pepin is extremely smart. And Pepin intermarries his family into the Merovingian family. And will start launching wars of conquest in different places we don't have to get into the details of. But Pepin really creates a new royal family called the Carolingian. That's their last name. And over time, Pepin is very good at really gaining control of the whole Frankish Empire. He's the one making decisions. He's running the place and giving advice to the Merovingian king, the official guy on the throne. But that Merovingian king basically accepts whatever Pepin advises. So even though Pepin is not the official king, he's the one making the real decisions. Does that make sense? Mostly because Pepin did a really good job at it. And so the Merovingian, the official king, basically figured if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The system's running well, let's allow it to keep running until you run into mistakes. Does that make sense? So this is confusing because you have an official Merovingian family on the throne, but you have this Carolingian family that's basically, in the real world, on a day-to-day basis, is actually running the place.
Why did he call the Carolinian family?
I can't remember. I think it's connected to the name Charles, but I'd have to look that up again. I don't recall offhand. Other questions? Nope. This Carolingian family becomes so powerful that it becomes hereditary. One of Pepin's sons will take over the mayor of the house. So when Pepin dies in 713, 714, this mayor of the house position is so powerful that Pepin's kids go at each other to try to get there, try to knock each other out to become the next mayor. Does that make sense?
How many kids does he have?
Oh God, like 8 or 12 or something. But it's also distant cousins that try it. I mean, it's a family civil war,
So it's like a feud. Whoever gets to the throne first.
and can beat off all the other,
Yeah.
destroy all the other competitors. And the eventual winner of this civil war is named Charles Martel. And he does so by throwing his brothers in jail or executing them or torturing them or bribing them to get them to go away. I mean, it's whatever he has to do.
The hammer.
Yep. So that tells you the kind of personality that he had. People were afraid of him. So that becomes his nickname. And he'll stay in office for a long time until he dies. I mean, he's there for decades. So that's like 30 some odd years, 37 years, 35 years.
So he was brutal.
Yeah. No, 27 years. Is that right? Something like that. Not good at math. And Charles Martel, he's through the rest of his lifetime, he's basically running the Frankish kingdom, even though he's not officially king. He's the mayor of the house. He's the chief of staff. And we have that now in the United States. You have an official president who makes the final decision, but it's the president's chief of staff who decides who gets to meet with the president and give advice. So that chief of staff position is extremely important. And it's usually the very first person that a newly elected president announces this is who the chief of staff is going to be. It's not who's going to be the head general or who's going to be the Secretary of Defense. It's that chief of staff that's the first named person. And you can trace that throughout all recent presidencies in the United States. And who that president chooses as chief of staff is often seen as a big indication of which way that newly elected president is going to go. Does that make sense? So Charles Martel is in that position. A big thing happens while he's in that position. Islam has already started in Western Arabia, and after Muhammad, the Muslims go out and they start conquering foreign lands over the next 100 years after Muhammad, and they build up a gigantic empire very quickly. Everything in green. By the time Charles Martel gets to be mayor, the Muslims now control basically all of North Africa, all of what we today call the Middle East, and they're attacking toward Constantinople every once in a while, trying to knock out the Byzantines. And in the early 700s, the Muslim Empire has been attacking Constantinople, but they're not winning. They keep getting defeated. So the Muslim leaders decide to basically do an end around Constantinople, to attack around from North Africa into Europe, and then go all the way around and conquer all of Europe, and then come to Constantinople from behind. Does that make sense?
It looks like they still didn't succeed.
Well, they succeed for a long time. They conquer North Africa. Then in 711, they go across into Iberia at the Battle of Guadalete, and they conquer what is today Portugal and Spain. And they'll control that for 800 years or something. And while Charles Martel is mayor of the house in the Frankish kingdom, right, in Gaul, that's when the Muslims decide to launch their next round of attacks into the Frankish kingdom. So Charles Martel sees himself and the Franks as the last powerful group, the last stand for Europeans against a Muslim invasion. Does that make sense? So Charles Martel gets all the Frankish leaders together, the Merovingian family, says, stop fighting each other, we're being invaded by this outside force. So let's all come together and try to fight off the foreign invasion. And he also gets kings, other German-type kings from all around Europe to contribute troops and to come to the battlefield. And Charles Martel portrays this as the war to defend Christianity. The Europeans believe if the Muslims win this war and conquer Europe, we're going to wipe out all the Christians and end Christianity in the world. So for Charles Martel and the Franks and their allies, this is basically an apocalyptic war.
Is it a religious war?
Yeah, for them.
Yeah.
Either they're going to win and survive, or they're going to lose and be annihilated. So this is the apocalypse to them. And they come out and fight in a way that shows that they really believe it. I used to have an image of, a nice picture of, or a painting of that battle. But the Franks and their allies win at the Battle of Tours in 732. And that's seen as a giant turning point in history, especially the history of Europe. The Franks and their friends win. The Muslim armies retreat back into Iberia and start planning another invasion, but that other invasion never really happens. Does that make sense? So that's another reason that he's called the Hammer. I mean, he brought together the Europeans and defended Christianity. Is that clear? It's very unclear if the Muslims won that war, if they would have wiped out all Christians, because they've already conquered Eastern Mediterranean, which is where Christianity comes from, right? So there's large Christian populations around that the Muslims did not annihilate, that they allowed to survive, and they just basically become taxpayers within the Islamic Empire. So perhaps this statement that we have to win this battle or else Christianity is going to be extinguished might just be kind of propaganda to their own forces to get them to fight to the death. Never surrender. It's much easier to motivate people to fight by saying, if we lose, you're going to be killed, and the enemy's going to come through and wipe out your whole family and everyone you know, and destroy the whole religion, rather than, well, if we lose, we'll probably just negotiate something. Right? Does that make sense, or am I the only person that makes sense to?
That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so questions about Tours? And you can tell it happens in what is today France, because it's a French word. You don't pronounce the S. It's just Tours. So that's a good indication. Moving on? Yes. All right. Let's see. Charles Martel dies in 741. And I can't remember. I think it's like his third or fourth son, something like that. One of the younger sons becomes the next mayor, mostly by making deals with his older brothers. So he becomes known as Pepin, named after his grandfather. And because there's two Pepins, they call him, this guy, Pepin the Short, because he's shorter. Pretty simple. And Pepin the Short is basically running this Frankish Empire. His big ambition is to become the official king. He wants to push aside this Merovingian family that is the official family on the throne. Remember, the mayor is just like the head advisor to the king. Pepin wants to become king himself and establish the Carolingian family, his family, as the kings, the monarchy. So he's going to start negotiating and trying to make deals and trying to figure out how he can accomplish this. Obviously, the Merovingians don't like this very much. You know, they've been the monarchs for almost a couple hundred years now. And, well, Pepin comes up with an idea of how to do this. Because so many people, a large majority of the people living in this Frankish kingdom, are now converted to Christianity, Pepin figures that the best way to get them to accept him as the new king is to get like a Christian authority to give a speech and officially declare Pepin to be the king. And that as followers of the Christian church, that the Christians throughout the empire would accept this. And right when he hits on this idea, kind of historical events intervene. The Bishop of Rome, which is seen as like one of the head bishops of the overall church, what is today the Pope. The Pope hadn't really kind of evolved that position yet. But the Bishop of Rome is still down here in Italy. And there's a group called the Lombards that are attacking from northern Italy and moving south, conquering land and getting close to Rome. And the person that we would today call Pope, the Bishop of Rome, feels very threatened by this. That if the Lombards attack and conquer and control Rome, that they might get rid of him and maybe choose someone else, who knows. So Pepin writes a letter to the Bishop of Rome, what we today call the Pope, and offers a deal. The deal is pretty simple. The Frankish kingdom is just on the other side of the Lombards. So Pepin says, I'll help you out. I'll attack the Lombards from the north and also send some armies down to Rome to defend you. And if this works in return, since I have helped you out, I've helped you survive, you can proclaim me king of the Franks. So it's a very clear political deal. I'll give you protection, you give me the title. And that's exactly what happens. He sends the Frankish armies out to attack the Lombards. The Lombards have to retreat from Rome. The Pope, the Bishop of Rome, is secured. And the Pope fulfills his side of the promise. He goes and crowns Pepin as the official king of the Franks.
And when this occurred, what? How many years after he?
I have to look up the exact year. I'm thinking. I think it's 768, but I'd have to look up that exact year. And this is a famous painting of the ceremony where the Pope shows up and puts the crown on Pepin's head. And this is Pepin kneeling down before the Pope to accept the crown. And the Pope has to justify this somehow. It's not like he can just show up and do this. He gives a speech and issues a statement saying that the Christian Church would like to see the, quote, title and power of the Frankish kingdom unified under one person. basically saying it's not good to have one king on a throne, but another person actually running the kingdom. Does that make sense? It has to be unified in one person, one decision maker. So that's the Pope's official statement saying why he has done this. Most historians don't really accept that argument very much. They think it was more of a deal to get protection from the Lombards. And Pepin seems so happy about this that he goes even a step further. Pepin invades parts of Italy and conquers land in Italy and gives that land to the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. And that area, that territory around Rome becomes known as the Papal States. It's like the Pope's own country. And the Pope is king of that country. So in theory, that territory, it's a lot of farmland and whatnot, will give the Pope enough tax revenue to build up his own armies to defend himself in the future. So this action, this giving of this land to the Pope, becomes known as the donation of Pepin. So you'll see that in the textbooks as what it is. Pepin conquered land and gave it to the Pope to kind of solidify their deal. And the Papal States will be around for a long, long time. Nearly 1,000 years. And I think even today, the area around the Vatican, the official kind of buildings of the church, that is officially run by the Vatican. It's their own country within Italy, if I remember right. What's it called? Vatican City? Mm-hmm. Something like that. And it's not very big. It's only a few miles kind of around.
Yeah, but they have connection under tunnels to where the Pope lives and everything.
Yeah, they run it like an independent country.
Mm-hmm.
And they obviously have like ambassadors that negotiate with the Italian government. And they kind of cooperate in a lot of things. Sometimes there's some famous disagreements, but there's millions of little details like that within negotiations. Okay, so questions about Pepin at all, or what he does, or why? No. Well, when Pepin died, he had two major sons, and he divided his empire, this kingdom, between the two sons. The older one is named, I think it's Carloman, and the younger one is named Charles. But Carloman died just a couple years after that, so when the older son died, the younger son, Charles, inherits everything. And he'll launch off on another series of conquests to expand the territory, and he'll be on the throne for, again, quite a while, several decades. He becomes known over time as Charles the Great, which in Latin translates as Charlemagne. And his ambition is really, much like Clovis, to reunite the western half of the Roman Empire, bring it all together under his control, and then merge it with the eastern half, the Byzantines, and rebuild the whole thing, the whole system. So he dedicates almost his entire life to accomplishing that. He launches several invasions to try to gain as much territory as possible. Doesn't always work very well, but he tries. Sometimes he has revolts against him, but we don't have to get into the details of that. But he does launch invasions eastward into what we today recognize as Germany, Central Europe, and conquers land. Some of those areas become known as the East March. He also launches more invasions even further into these kind of purple areas. Those invasions, they do some damage to his enemies, but he can never totally control them. So this area in white he does control, but these purplish areas are places that he threatens to invade pretty consistently, But that over time transforms into really just a threat in order to get them to pay a ransom to not get invaded. And that'll develop into, over a few years, he'll basically bring his armies out to the eastern border every spring and threaten to invade all these places in purple, and then send them a letter saying, well, I won't invade you if you give me a bunch of money. And that becomes known as tribute. It's basically a yearly tax to avoid being invaded. And he does it every single spring, so it's a big moneymaker for him. And his statement is basically, we control them because they're paying us. Which is a easy thing to say when you don't really control them. They still have their own laws and their own customs, and they're not totally under Charlemagne's thumb. Does that make sense? So it's just kind of trying to save his own credibility. So he'll say that in government documents. We actually control all these eastern lands, but in reality, day-to-day life, they're not under Charlemagne's government. He also launches an invasion trying to reconquer what on this map is called Spain, down here in the corner. He wants to reconquer Iberia because that was part of the Roman Empire. The problem is that the Muslim armies are still there, and they're extremely powerful. They're large armies occupying this place. So he launches an attack over the Pyrenees Mountains and conquers some land, but the Muslim counterattack kind of pushes him back up to that little border area on here called the Spanish March. So in official documents, he'll say, we launched this great invasion, and to our glory, we conquered all this gigantic amount of land right here in this little strip. But it's a dishonest statement because he wanted to conquer the rest of the peninsula, and he was defeated. So again, he's trying to save his credibility. He's trying to save face. So Charles the Great was not as great as he intended. Does that make sense? Okay. And in official documents, he's saying he's reconquering the whole western half of the Roman Empire. And he starts writing letters, especially to Constantinople, saying he wants to be named the official emperor of the West under Roman authority, just like Clovis was. And gets the exact same response from Constantinople, which at first is silence. They don't want to answer his letter because he's powerful. They don't want to offend him, but they don't want to elevate him to their level. Does that make sense? Same old story. So over many years, he's negotiating with Constantinople to get that title. And he basically says, what do I have to do to convince you that this western half is just as great as the eastern half? And what do you think their response is? It's not. Well, they'll tell him it's not, right? And they say, we're looking at the map and we've done a study. Your area is not as great as our area. And he asks, well, what do I have to do? And they give him a giant list of all the stuff he has to do to fulfill their demands. And that's something that often happens in negotiations. What do I have to do? Well, here's 80 things you have to do, right? And they probably figure there's no way he's actually going to try to do all this stuff. It's something to kind of string him along so he eventually gives up. But he's not a giving up type of person, so he actually starts doing all this stuff. And the first big one that they demanded was that he build a great, giant capital city. The Merovingians and the Carolingians, their usual governing method is to not stay in one city. They tend to travel all over their empire. They go from place to place. So they're not housed in one place. The government is not housed in one building, in one city. Does that make sense? It's a traveling thing. It's on tour. And the leaders in the East in Constantinople say, well, that's not how the Romans govern a place. You have to build a great, glorious capital city. So he tries to do that. He starts spending huge amounts of money to build a capital city at Aachen, which is a German word. And interestingly, it's kind of today right on the border between France and Germany. So the French call it à la Chapelle, and the Germans call it Aachen, as their kind of languages separate and their cultures separate. But on this map, it's called Aachen, so I just write that up there. And he starts building huge amounts of money on government buildings, and then paving the roads, and all this stuff that a glorious Roman city is supposed to have. And then he'll write a letter to Constantinople a few years later and say, "We have our capital city. Now can I become emperor of the West?" And they say, "No, you have to do this, this, and this, and this, and this." And it just keeps going on and on. So here is a couple images of the official Christian church at Aachen, built really from nothing, from the ground up. So it's a whole complex of buildings, right? And Charlemagne, the king's official chapel, is just one of the buildings, and this image on the right is an image of the inside of this thing, and it's massive. Right? The altar is way down here. See the size of the altar and the audience, the pews, and the organ? So, this thing is several stories tall with all these windows and columns and giant chandelier and whatnot. Now, this is hugely expensive. It takes years to build. And you have to remember, at this point in European history, they're not building like the old Romans had. They've forgotten a lot of that technology. So they forgot how to build this kind of stuff, and they have to kind of refigure it out again. So it's a massive government expenditure just to get this thing off the ground. So that's just one example. And of course, this is a government, so they're building several government buildings. They have to build a treasury and an archive and the administrative building where decisions are made and messages go. They have to build a barracks for the soldiers to defend the place. It just goes on and on and on. Then you have to build houses for the workers' families to live in. So it's like constructing a city from the ground up. And he keeps writing letters to Constantinople saying, "When are you going to declare me emperor of the West?" And they keep putting him off and putting him off. And eventually he just apparently loses patience and calls up the Pope and asks the Pope to come and give Mass at his official residence on Christmas Day in the year 800. And Charlemagne's official statement is that he invited the Pope to give Mass, and the Pope shows up and starts the ceremony. And in the middle of the ceremony, Charlemagne the king has to get up and kind of bow before the Pope, right? And Charlemagne says when he's bowing in front of the Pope whips out this crown, plops it on his head, and says, "Now you're emperor of the West." That's what Charlemagne said. Basically, I didn't plan this. This is something the Pope chose to do himself, and I'll take it.
Okay.
But historians usually doubt that argument. They mostly think that Charlemagne demanded that the Pope come and maybe paid him. So the Pope, that Charlemagne knew this was going to happen, and it was all intricately negotiated. But, Charlemagne's a politician. And politicians often say that stuff. It's not like I really want to be the leader of all of you. It's that you want me to be the leader, so I guess I can live with that. Right? And that's what, even in the United States, it was very unpopular for a long time for people running for president to officially say that they want to be president. Really until about the 1960s. Most presidents say, I'm giving in to popular demand, right? They used to call it being drafted into the White House. The people demand that I run for president, therefore I guess I'll do it. Yeah. Not doing much else this year, so why not? But we know the reality is they kind of plan this out over time. But the American people don't like to think of it like that. They like to think that the people are really in control. And it's kind of a strange way to think about it, because today it's the exact opposite. When people announce they're running for president and call the media and they have this giant event and say how they're going to be the great leader and on and on and on, right? So we kind of live with a different expectation today. But politics evolves like that. It changes over time. Just kind of what's normal, what's seen as normal. So, question about Charlemagne? Or how he becomes emperor? Constantinople, they never really accept this. They don't like it. They don't refer to him as emperor, but he's happy with it. But Charlemagne also runs into a problem we've seen in many different civilizations, many different kingdoms all around Europe in the periphery, at least. We've seen this with Egypt, we've seen it with the Persians, on and on and on. How do you convince a multinational, multi-ethnic population to actually accept your rule? How do you keep control over them? Charlemagne's empire is very large. There's many different cultural groups with different, sometimes even religious ideas, different languages, definitely, using different kinds of money, different social norms. And one of his great kind of tasks, one of his goals, is to figure out how to actually keep all these people under control for the long term. Number one, we've already talked about, he built a centralized government, centralized bureaucracy at Aachen. And he realizes that if you have a centralized government, the people working for you have to be able to know how to read and write. Because they have to be able to read messages and send messages. And the people running your treasury have to know something about math and accounting, because otherwise they'll screw up the numbers and you'll run out of money. And at this point in European history, after the Roman Empire fell in the 400s, a lot of people don't know how to read or write anymore. It's just gone. This is a dark age, just like we talked about with ancient Greece. Once the stability is gone, people become so worried about just daily survival, about not being attacked, not being murdered, and having enough food to eat. They don't have time to go to school anymore. They're not trying to get enough food together. Does that make sense? So Europe is in a dark age at this point. And Charlemagne is trying to run a kind of centralized bureaucratic government that a lot of people he's hiring they don't know how to read. A lot of them, even some of the richest people in his government, they don't know how to read and write their own name when he gets started. So does anyone know how they sign official government documents then? If you can't write your name, how do you sign it? Huh?
With a stamp, like
Yeah.
a symbol.
Yeah, you had a symbol for your family, you'd stamp it in. Sometimes they just draw an X on the paper. And they call that leaving your mark. And what else are you going to do if you don't know how to write your name? Right? So this is the level that Charlemagne has to deal with. And his advisors tell him that if we're going to run an efficient government, we have to start building schools and at least teaching the children of rich people how to read and write, because they're going to be the future government employees. Does that make sense? So he'll start building schools and even a kind of like college system in Aachen itself to teach basic, like what we would think of as elementary school level reading and writing and math. Does it make sense? So really just the basics, nothing very advanced. And he starts building smaller schools, especially like monasteries all over the empire, to try to bring in the next generation and teach them from an early age how to do this stuff. Some scholars and textbooks call this the Carolingian Renaissance. Renaissance meaning rebirth, so it's like a rebirth of knowledge. So you may see that in documentaries or textbooks, depending on who you're talking to, what you're reading and watching. A lot of historians are very skeptical of that term because they argue that this is not a rebirth of knowledge. The Carolingian Renaissance does not create new philosophy or new advances in math or anything like that. Basically what they do is copy the old Roman and Greek texts. And they teach people to read that stuff. So they're not really creating their own materials, their own knowledge. They're just trying to refine all the old stuff that the Greeks and the Romans did. Does that make sense? And that's what they're going with. So there's more knowledge spreading around, there's more education, but some historians hesitate to call it a full-blown renaissance, a leap in technology or research or anything like that. Because it's not a leap. It's going back a few hundred years and figuring out what they did back then. Another thing he does is divide his huge empire up into 300 smaller pieces that he calls counties, or the textbooks will call counties. And each county will get a head administrator, like a local governor, that he calls a count. So this would be like admitting that the United States is way too big of a territory for one person to govern. So they break it up into 50 different counties. Does that make sense? 50 different localized areas. And that's where the word comes from. And the person in control of that area is called a count, and they work directly for the king. He also appoints a general with some soldiers to each county. So the military leader of the county is called the duke. And depending on the size of the county, they might have control over a few hundred and maybe a couple thousand soldiers. Well, the same thing that Darius did and that other governments have done in the past. Break up this huge empire into localized areas and appoint someone to run the place and someone to defend the place, someone to enforce the laws. And just like we saw with Roman history, Charlemagne becomes very worried that if you appoint a count and that count spends all of his time in that county, he can start making deals with the rich people of that area. And maybe at some point start a conspiracy to break away and declare independence from the empire and start their own little government. So Augustus in Rome realized this, and others have. And the interesting thing is that Charlemagne hits on the exact same solution. Don't let those counts and those dukes stay in the same place for too long. Move them around. That will stop them from making long-term contact within the places they govern and will prevent uprisings against you. So it's the exact same idea. Break the empire up into small pieces, appoint some administrators, but don't let them stay very long. Move them around. Rotate them consistently. And it works very well for his lifetime at least, and his son who takes over for him when he dies. Another thing they do is called the Mayfield. This is when Charlemagne calls all his armies to him. They go out to the east and they threaten these invasions that we already talked about, remember? It's in the springtime, so they call it the Mayfield. And the first few years they're really preparing for invasion. They're getting ready for war. But after they start demanding this tribute, these tax payments every year, it becomes more of a yearly celebration where they come together, and the Mayfield becomes like almost like a national holiday, where all the elites and all the armies renew their allegiance to Charlemagne. So instead of being a preparation for war, it becomes more like a big party that happens every year in May.
Spring break.
Yep. Well, up until pretty recently, at least the last 100 years, when wars are fought, especially in Europe, they only fight in the spring and summer. Because once the snow starts to fall, armies can't really move around, and armies basically go into hibernation. They find some place to set up for the winter, and they just stay there, and they wait for the snow to melt, and when the weather gets warm, they start the war again. So that's why Charlemagne would gather all his troops in May, because that's when the weather's getting warm and the snow's melting, and they can come out and start fighting, relaunch the invasions. But again, over time, it kind of evolves into more of a national party with the king on hands than a real preparation for war. But even with moving around all these bureaucrats and doing all this stuff, Charlemagne and his government, they still do not trust the local leaders. They're afraid that even the council starts stealing or start making deals or forming conspiracies. So they do a very similar thing that Darius and the Romans did. They set up a system of spies that go out into the counties, and they get jobs within the count's system, the tax collection system, or the accounting system, or the military system. They go to work every day, and they talk to others in the office and whatnot, and they try to get information about any embezzlement or conspiracies or anything like that, any independence movements, any rebellions, and they report that stuff back to the king in the capital city, to Charlemagne himself. So they become known as the Missi Dominici, which basically means like the king's guys, the emissaries of the emperor, but they're spies. No one knows who they are. So this would be like if you go to work, and if you work in like an office kind of setting, it's like the company has hired spies and sent them into the office to spy on the office workers to see what they're talking about. Look for theft. And you never know who's a spy, right? The person in the cubicle next to you might be really reporting to the company about what's being whispered around the hallways. Does that make sense? And that's a very great threat to everyone, because when anyone you talk to can be a spy and you don't know who they are, that really clamps down on people starting conspiracies, because you don't know who you can trust. Anyone you talk to can turn you over. Does that make sense? And Charlemagne does not deal with disloyalty very nicely. He's an emperor. He's a brutal guy. All right. And the third thing he does is he doesn't just build like schools or schooling system in the capital city. He scales that up across the empire. And most of these become monasteries. That is officially run by the church, but with government funding. Because the Christian church is the center of education in Europe at this point. There are no public schools. They don't exist. So Charlemagne combined his desire to use Christianity for stability, try to convert every living person in your empire to Christianity, therefore there'd be some kind of unity. But he started helping the church build up local schools, local monasteries. So the children of, usually the rich people of that area will send their kids to this monastery so they can be educated at least through young age, so they can learn to read and write and do math at a basic level. And as he's building these monasteries all over the place with the church's support, so it's a cooperation between the religious leaders and the political leaders, he also declares all these holdings to be what he calls the Holy Roman Empire. So it takes on a religious-sounding type of name. And that term, that entity, will stick around for 1,000 years. So you'll see that in textbooks. Not always very powerful, but there will be a Holy Roman Emperor for another 1,000 years. So going far into History 6, modern Western Civ. Okay, so Charlemagne finally dies in 814. Charlemagne has really one so-called legitimate son, and his son Louis takes over for him when Charlemagne dies. And Louis will be on the throne for the rest of his life, so he'll be there for decades. Louis is a very different kind of personality from Charlemagne. Charlemagne, Charlemagne inspired fear in people. People were afraid of him because he's such a cutthroat kind of politician. His son Louis is very different. Louis sees himself more as a kind of like philosopher and a religious type leader. So Louis doesn't like to get his hands dirty with having to execute people who speak out against him and that kind of stuff. He has other people do that stuff. So Louis is not nearly as heavy-handed as Charlemagne was. But Louis' advisors, the people that kind of run the government on a daily basis, they are just as brutal. So Louis stays in power, even though he's not kind of actually running the place all the time.
Louis is the son of Charles.
Yep. So he becomes known as Louis the Pious because he doesn't want to do all that violent stuff that, emperors and warlords and whatnot, they have to do to stay in control. And before you get democracy, the whole place is run by kings, and if you want to stay on your throne, you've got to kill people and torture people that speak out against you to inspire enough fear in the population where they'll stop talking about revolution. So Louis stays on the throne. He dies in 840. And when Louis dies, he has three major sons, that start fighting each other to decide who's going to be the next big emperor. They fight each other for 3 years. And because there's three of them, no one can gain the upper hand over the other two. Does that make sense? So it's a three-way civil war that goes on for years. And eventually, they decide on a treaty to end their war in 843, where the three sons basically divide the empire into 3 different areas, and each son will get a territory. So one guy named Charles gets the western part, the western Frankish kingdom. The oldest son, named Lothar, he gets the middle part, and he gets to officially proclaim himself to be the emperor of the whole thing. And another son gets the eastern part. His name's Louis. So they divide the empire into 3 pieces. And this is where you start getting a real separation in languages and customs and even laws, because each of the 3 are going to run their own territories differently. Does that make sense? So this is where you start seeing the real separation into a western half that eventually evolves into France, and they start developing French language and customs, and an eastern half that evolves into Germany. Right? Does that make sense? So Clovis had been trying to unify these places for years and years, and every king in line had been trying to unify these places, but at this point, this is where you start getting a split again. And virtually all historians agree with that statement. This is where the split in the cultures between French and German begin. They'll eventually become different countries. So the Treaty of Verdun is important for that. It splits the empire into 3 pieces. So, questions about
So the third
that?
kingdom is Charles,
Kingdom of Charles?
Louis, and
Yep. And Lothar.
Kingdom of Lothar.
In the middle. Yeah, when those become eventually countries, France and Germany, they'll fight over that middle ground for years and years and years and years and years and years. And those become some of the biggest battlefields of the world wars. So this has long-term impacts. Does it make sense? Still good with that? Yeah. All right. Let's see. And really in the mid to late 800s, each of these 3 guys start running into huge problems. They start getting invaded on all sides. Number one, there are Muslim armies that try to attack, and sometimes they're successful. They come out of North Africa and they attack all these islands off of Italy, and sometimes try to launch attacks against Italy itself. So the Carolingian kings have to worry about that for a while. Another big problem is the Magyars that come from kind of north of the Black Sea, and they start attacking westward into Europe. So the Carolingian kings have to deal with that. They can stop those evasions for the most part. The big one they cannot stop is the northerners, that on this map are called Vikings. And they'll launch attacks all along the coastline of all the Carolingian holdings. And they become extremely successful because they use basically like hit and run type tactics. The Norse develop military technology called longboats. This is their big advantage. It's a boat that's big enough to hold a whole bunch of soldiers and supplies. So it can, and it's strong enough to sail in the ocean. So the heavy ocean current pushing the boat around on the water, the boat will survive, right? So it's a very strong boat, but it's also very shallow. And that allows them to sail not just in the ocean, but down the river systems of Europe. So the Norse, the northerners, at first start hit and run attacks along the coastline, but once they develop these longboats, they'll be able to attack further inland down the river systems. Does that make sense? So that's how longboats are important. And with this map, you can see how successful that is. They're not just hitting the coastline of the North Sea or the Atlantic Ocean. They're going up and down the rivers and getting way into the middle of Europe and hitting big cities. And their military tactic is basically hit and run. They'll attack a city. If they win the battle, they'll invade the city, conquer the city, and steal whatever they can of any value, put it on their boats, and run back to their homes, wherever they come from. And they do this before the Carolingians can get their army together and get back to that city and counterattack. So they'll conquer a city maybe for a couple of days, and then they vacate, they leave. And this is one of the problems with big empires. You can have a big army, but you can't be everywhere at the same time, right? So the Norse, the northerners or the Vikings, they'll hit one city, and by the time the kings get their army together and go to that city, the enemy's already gone. And they're going to another place to attack another area. So the Carolingians are always playing catch-up. And the Norse get away with this over and over again because you don't have enough soldiers to guard every single city all the time. Question?
Did they ever kind of come to the conclusion that maybe they should set up shop at some ports and kind of wait for it to happen?
Yeah, but there's way too many rivers. They don't have enough soldiers even to do that. There's so many rivers that if you try to guard them all, each one will be weak, right? They're only going to have a few soldiers. Not enough to stop the attack. And the Franks or the Carolingians, whatever you want to call them by this point, they can never figure it out. They never have a solution to this. So you'll officially have these three Carolingian kings on the throne, but since they can't defend their own territory, after decades and decades, after these three guys die off and they give their territory to their kids or whatever, a lot of people living in the kingdoms, they can't even remember who their king is. Because who cares? They're not doing their job. Right? Does that make sense? They can't defend the territory, so yeah, there's a king on a throne somewhere, but I don't know his name. So the responsibility for defending each of these towns and cities, really falls to local leaders called counts, the local governors. And the Carolingians, they'll be officially around on paper on a throne somewhere, but no one cares who they are. There's much more allegiance to your local count, or your duke, or mayor, or whatever they're called, whoever can get a bunch of soldiers together and try to defend your town. Does that make sense? So the Carolingian Empire breaks down again by the 900s, or in the 900s.
Maybe officially on a map it's a unified empire, but not in reality. And it's because the Carolingian leaders, they could never figure out how to stop this. They never have a solution. So eventually they just kind of peter out.